Huntsville at the time with no air conditioning was just brutal. And there was a drugstore downtown that had air conditioning, and my mother used to go there in the afternoons to get an ice cream or something, anything to justify being able to sit there in the air conditioning. So the other acclamation that they really had problems with was this business about alcohol. I mean, the Germans, when they were at White Sands, at least were able to drink a lot of beer, and all of a sudden they come to this place where you could not go to a restaurant and order a drink. And back then what they had is they had these clubs where you'd pay like $1 to join the club, and you'd bring your liquor in a brown bag, and they would serve, give you a soft drink or something to mix it with. And my parents just thought that was absolutely crazy. And that brings another part of my story about alcohol. Asawintha. I know. When Reiner started talking about it, I thought, man, you're going to steal all my thunder.
That's why I went first.
My mother, I remember, she used to make iced tea for us, and she'd put them in these big brown jugs. Okay. The lady that ran the place would constantly come out, and she'd have to sniff it and check to make sure that the Germans hadn't snuck in some alcohol. I don't think she was being prudish because of any convictions. She was just afraid that if she allowed alcohol and the sheriff found out about it, that, they might shut her down, because they were running a business there. So, but anyway, it's just, my parents complained about that all the time. We got this wonderful place, picnic place, right by the river. The kids are playing in the water, and we can't drink beer. What is this about? So, that was one of the stories. And one thing I remembered about the little store is the fact that, they sold ice cream, the little ice cream cones and things. And that's what I remember as a child mostly, is other than playing in the water, going to get an ice cream was the funny thing. And like Reiner, I went back there a couple of years ago. I wanted to check this place out, see if it was still there, and it is still there, and it's exactly like you described it. So, another story I had, Reiner was talking about later on the people bought the lake lots. Well, when I was 12, a friend of mine and I stayed with one of the German families that had a lot that overlooked one of the tributaries of the Gunnersville of the Tennessee River. And I noticed whenever we were eating out on the balcony, you'd see these boats come by and people looking around, and the owners told me that those were deputy sheriffs coming in their boats trying to make sure that nobody was drinking in this dry county. It's really hard to think of that in today's day and time because Huntsville has come so far, but it was really rough for my parents. The other big thing was the fact that when they came to Huntsville, instead of all being together like they'd been at Fort Bliss, all of a sudden they each bought houses in different parts of town. And other than maybe the group that was up on Montesano, which kind of stuck together, we weren't part of that group. So we tended to live in parts of Huntsville where we tended, at least myself, I would play with whatever boys were in the neighborhood, not necessarily German boys, but American boys. So anyway, that's pretty much my recollection. I'll pass it on to George.
George von Tiesenhausen earned his PhD from the University of Alabama and became a well-respected educator in the local area, retiring as adjunct faculty from UAH. Over the years, George and his wife, both educators, have touched and influenced many lives in Huntsville. Now, many of you know that George's dad, George von Tiesenhausen Sr., just passed away in June at the age of 104. You've got longevity on your side.
I don't know about that. He took all the longevity.
George von Tiesenhausen.
Thank you. I won't talk about Osavinta, you've kind of covered that. The alcohol thing was very vivid in my mind. Enid Edwards, I think was the lady's name who ran the place, and she had a daughter by the name of Patricia, whom I got to know later on very well. There were many things that these two friends of mine here touched on that sparked memories. And I was thinking, gee, should I change my whole format here and address that? But no, I think what I would like to do is to tell you the venture that we made coming from Germany over here. I was born at the end of the war in a tumultuous situation. My father was in an American prisoner of war camp, and it was, the way he describes it in his memoirs, was brutal. He was finally released about 2 or 3 months after the war, and he made his way back to Germany, and somewhere here in Europe is a family, maybe, who are living somewhere, maybe, and we don't really know where and what. They had agreed tentatively to meet in a place called Thüringen, which is a province, one of the countries of Germany, and specifically in a small town called Heberndorf, which is where I was born. And my mother was about to leave that town when, lo and behold, this strange person starts hobbling up the street there and looking around, and instead of going straight to the place where he was supposed to go, he stopped by this well, and he had to drink some water. And then my mother was coming, and of course, a big reunion. We kept going from there back to the northern part of Germany, and we stayed in a city called Rothenburg-Wümme. That's what it's called today. Back then it was called Rothenburg-Hannover. The Wümme River runs right through town, and it was a beautiful little town, very small town. Today it's a pretty large city. Everything was just pristine, totally untouched by the war. But we were in British occupied territory. And when we arrived up there, we had transported ourselves in coal cars. And if you've ever seen the inside of a coal car, you know that the soot is about 1 inch deep. And my older sister and I loved to play in this stuff, so when we arrived, we had changed color considerably. My grandmother took us and bathed us and cleaned us and so forth, and we lived for a while in a large house that my great-grandfather had built. He had been the Surgeon General for the Navy, and he was now the city doctor, and he had built this house as a clinic. And pretty soon the city built a clinic, so the house just became an apartment house, and pretty soon the British decided that we needed to have more boarders, and more and more the house was taken over until finally the British took the house. And there was a barn on the side, and we were allowed to renovate the barn, live there, and pay rent, which was very strange for us. The chickens that we always had were no longer our chickens. The garden where we ate our fruit was no longer our garden. The apple trees and so forth were no longer our apple trees. And so we kids, we were really up a creek. And now my older sister and I, we became the best food thieves of the entire neighborhood. We would crawl through the furrows, the rhubarb furrows, these great big leaves, just hide underneath it. And then we take a knife. Yes, we had knives. My mother didn't know. And you cut off, there's a trick to this. You got to cut off the leaf, the stem right under the leaf, so that the leaf is still there and the turgor pressure is still in it. And you cut off the stem and you inch back and you cut off another one. And by the time you get out of the furrow, slowly the leaves kind of just fold in and leave this long trail of wilted leaves along. And the farmer was out there, and he had a rifle or a shotgun or something that really blasted, and he would shoot at us. So we'd run behind the hazelnut tree, and we eat this, whatever we had, rhubarb or a green cabbage, kale you call it. We call it grünkohl. And I'm writing a little book now, kind of a memoir, we call it Grünkohl mit Schnee, which means kale with snow. Because kale grows when the snow is still on the ground. And somehow kale doesn't taste good unless there's snow on it. You have to eat that. And hazelnuts, it was a hazelnut tree, and we ate the hazelnuts. They were usually not quite ripe, and we'd crack them open with a stone, and we'd eat them, And we were always hungry. There was just not enough food to go around. But anyway, so in the late 40s, then my father was asked to come to this country, and he was supposed to take a lie detector test, and he decided, if they don't believe me, then they can do without me. And then they were asking, finally in 1952, von Braun wrote him a letter and said, look, why don't you come over? And they arranged so that after we came over, and if we didn't like it after 1 year, he would make sure that they would send us back, freight prepaid, and go back to where we were. Well, the thing is, my father was about to get into a job which was his hobby, which he would do whether he got paid for it or not. We, however, weren't quite so fortunate. We were in Huntsville, and you had already described Huntsville a little bit, and I will go into that a little bit more later. It was a town, a one-horse town, and the horse had sense enough to leave. So there we were, 15,000 people. Some of them were educated, but not too many. Nothing, no culture, nothing. Anyway, so we had to go, and we had to go by ship. So what I'm about to read to you is the episode of our trip over here. Now, I have it in German and I have it in English, and it's much better in German because it happened in German. But I got this feeling that most of you probably would not understand me, am I right? Okay. So the English, which I just did a couple of days ago, I wrote this in 2007, so I just translated this very quickly. So if the flavor doesn't come quite through, you'll have to bear with me. Are we there yet? How much longer do we still have to go? Where are we going anyway? There seemed to be no end to the train trip, but I rather enjoyed it since I always did enjoy riding on trains. We were supposed to go to America, but that was all still too unclear to me yet. We had left Uetersen early in the morning and went from there to Pinneberg with the Bimmelbahn, a small commuter train, and then on to Hamburg. The Bimmelbahn was electric, and it could always happen that the electricity went out and that we would find ourselves on the tracks in the middle of nowhere before the juice was turned back on and we could proceed. By this time, however, all went well. The roof of the Hamburg train station and several of the tracks were still destroyed from the war. We stood on the platform waiting for the train. All around us were other people deep in their own thoughts. Frequently, I saw men who were missing an arm or a leg, who hobbled along in their patched loading coats, caps, and expressionless faces, sometimes carrying suitcases, sometimes with just sacks containing all of their otherworldly possessions. I always looked along the tracks for the train, and always Mutti, the German word for a mom, Mutti pulled me back. But finally I saw the headlight of the train as it steamed around the corner, and yes, there were steam engines. The locomotive hissed and screamed as the engineer pulled the brakes, and with that releasing vast quantities of steam which fogged up all the waiting passengers. One could barely make out the loudspeaker announcement over the noise. Hamburg Hauptbahnhof, Endstation, alle aussteigen. It was Hamburg main train station, terminus, everybody off. The wooden doors opened, and all the trains had wooden doors, and a human mass poured out onto the platform, mixing with those who wanted to get on. Kids, stay together. Come on now, hold on to my dress. Take Fadi's hand, otherwise you get lost. Fadi means daddy, I grabbed Fadi's hand and held on, even though he carried a suitcase with the same hand. We pushed into the train car and soon wedged ourselves onto two wooden benches. Fadi went through the train cars in search of a compartment because we would be riding through the night, and we kids would need to get some sleep. The conductor came to punch the tickets, and soon thereafter Fadi came back. He had found a compartment. We packed our things together and waddled through the passageway as the train already rocked back and forth into tracks. 3 cars up, Fadi opened up a compartment door, and we squeezed inside. There were already 2 people there, and we 5 pushed inside. Since all compartments were designed for 6 people, my younger sister Jutta had to sit on Mutti's lap, and so everyone was content. Fadi stuffed the suitcases onto the rack above, and we prepared for a long trip. We were going to Landshut, which is in Bavaria. I loved to look out the window and often quarreled with my 2 sisters for a window seat. The train moved right along, and everything outside flew rapidly past the window. I saw fields, often small villages, and then once in a while a larger city, most of them lying in total ruins. Here and there, 3-wheeled trucks drove along the country highway. 3 wheels needed less rubber, I was told. There was one small truck with a chimney. This truck was fueled with wood and left a terrible smoke cloud as it rattled along. Fadi tried to explain to me how that worked, but it didn't make much sense to me. Soon we crossed the Elbe, rode into the direction of Heidelberg to Landshut. We kids slept on the benches, flopping around as the train rocked from side to side. Mutti had brought along a few sandwiches, which we kids quickly polished off. Fadi and Mutti ate what was left, though I believe there was very little of that. Once in a while, the train stopped and people got off and on. So about 1 a.m., the 2 gentlemen in our compartment got off, and we now had the entire place for ourselves. So we stretched out and we got some sleep. In the morning, we arrived at the Landshut main train station, and Mr. Losboom picked us up and brought us to a very beautiful house with a garden and much grass. Here we were to stay for the next few days until the 26th of May. In the course of the day, I found a push lawnmower and pushed it through the grass. That was a lot of fun because I'd never seen such a machine before. After my lawn mowing play, there were paths crisscross across the lawn. It looked like a maze. Mr. Losboom drove us to an American camp where we were to be processed. We had to get onto a bus with American soldiers, sit all the way in the back, and not say a word. I listened to the funny language and decided immediately that my mouth and lips would never be able to produce such sounds. It just sounded like wow, 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 while you're pinching your nose. Years later, I saw a Peanuts cartoon. Every time the adult spoke, you heard this wow, wow, wow. It seemed like Charles Schulz had the same impression I did. We arrived at an enormous barracks where we got off and were led into a huge room. The soldiers had no facial expressions, were quietly engrossed in their thoughts, staring ahead and stoically performing their robotic tasks. Then came the command that we all had to undress. Fadi and I went between 2 drapes, undressed, and emerged back, buck naked, into the large room. I couldn't understand the purpose of the drapes since we were all assembled in the same room. A so-called doctor went past each person, grabbed him between the legs and fumbled around briefly without washing his hands in between. Several people were led away and the rest were told to get dressed again. We felt like a herd of cattle to be auctioned off on the market. In the end, we were doused with some powder, which I later learned was DDT, and then we had to wait. We had to do a lot of waiting. I was hungry. I was always hungry. But this time, both my sisters were also hungry, and Fadi went around trying to find something to eat. Since he spoke fluent English, he was soon successful and brought some very strange American food. We were told that this was bread. A little flimsy, I thought, but when you're hungry, whatever. On May 18th was Fadi's 49th birthday. We made a picnic on the meadow. Mutti had placed a large cloth over the grass and covered it with wildflowers. We got buttered bread and cocoa. It was an especially beautiful day. We children played and ran around after butterflies, but could not catch them. After a gorgeous day, we returned to the house, which had a huge, deep basin in front, filled with water. Aha! For us, that was, of course, a swimming pool. England and I went in immediately. Later, we went back to the American base where Fadi and Mutti had to fill out more reams of paper. On the 25th of May, we traveled to Bremerhaven, way up north, which was all under British occupation, and was not far from where we originally lived in Rothenburg. We had lived several years in Rothenburg, Hanover, in a large house, and later in a renovated barn. The house was one that my great-grandfather built in 1903, which was then confiscated by the English in 1949. We were then allowed to rent our own barn and live there. On the 26th of May, 1953, we were driven to the harbor at Bremerhaven to a ship, an old American troop transport by the name of USS General Alexander Patch. The name seemed to fit quite well. Then the word came that all women and children would have cabins on the upper decks while the men would be housed in the hold. At that point, Muddy began to scream and cry and make a huge spectacle. She refused to go on board if she and we kids could not be in the same cabin with Fadi. At first, the Amis, this is what Germans call Americans, the Amis did not want to allow that because they had their orders. Muddy, however, insisted, and finally the word came that of course Fadi would be allowed to be with the family in the upper cabin. But my younger sister Jutta had to share a bed with Muddy. After all that commotion, I suddenly didn't want to go either, and I began to cry loudly. In order to calm me down and to persuade me to get onto the ship, Muddy said that in America there was no school. My face sobered, and immediately I was quite willing to board. You can imagine my consternation when later on, after we had been there and school started, that I had to go to school. Everything was clear, so we boarded and found our cabin. There were many American soldiers on board who were now being transported home. Some even had wives with them whom they acquired in Germany. I later learned that they were called war brides, a number of whom were promised by their new husbands that they owned large parcels of land, that they would have wonderful lives in the U.S. Often they arrived to find something that promised much less. And then we were there. A large group of European experts, many in scientific areas that did not yet exist in the USA. Among those were computer, physics, biology, and chemistry experts, and especially expert in rocket science and engineering. It was an interesting fit. In the afternoon, as the ship was slowly pushed and pulled away from the wharf, a small orchestra played. Played Now Goodbye to You, My Dear Homeland. And that's when my tears came in torrents. Suddenly the thought hit me in the head that we would probably never come back, and that this was permanent. Up to now, things were somewhat adventuresome, but now the truth of everything at home. And the truth then did not appeal to me much. The first evening, we kids had to go to bed at 8 p.m. I slept on top left, my older sister Eva Maria on the top right. Fadi slept under my bed, and Muddy slept with Jutta underneath Eva Maria. On the ceiling by the wall was a small fan, whose blades were made of rubber. That was the only air circulation we had. Of course, Fadi had to prove that the rubber blades could not hurt him, so he promptly stuck his finger into the blades, to Eva Maria's great surprise and loud scream. She quickly quieted down when Fadi's finger returned intact. Then to bed, with a constant rocking of the ship lulled us to sleep. The weather was mostly good, except for a couple of storms. One of those hit us in the English Channel, whereupon our suitcases slid from one end of the cabin to the other, and our coats hung in the closet at a slant. For safety, we got dressed and even put on our swim vests. Jutta's, age 4, was a size large, which meant for a large soldier, even though she was not yet quite 4 years old. Mostly, however, the weather was nice, and we could sit on the deck chairs and let the sun trickle down on us. We never got seasick, although other passengers threw up all over the place, and then, with their either green or white, chalk-white faces, pulled themselves along the railing back to their cabins. The 27th of May was my birthday. Of course, Fadi and Muddy did not bring along a present, so they had to find something in a small store on board. The store only had 2 toy cap pistols, with which I amused myself enormously. I jumped out from around the corner of every place, scared with the cajitos out of the other passengers, who decided that I would probably blend quite well into American society. I played many years with these 2 pistols, the holsters and the belt. We steamed between Dover and Calais, and in the distance we could see the white cliffs of the English coastline. A few days later, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the ship Queen Elizabeth II passed us by in under 1 hour. Once in a while there was a thick fog and we could see nothing. And then the fog horn blew constantly, a mournful noise which one cannot ever forget. We did not have too much good luck with the food. The dishes were all foreign to us and the quantities were divided differently. In Germany, a typical breakfast consists of a little muesli, which is kind of a muesli, or a piece of bread with jam and coffee or tea. In the after-war times, however, we had no muesli, jam, nor coffee, so we put sugar on our bread, or, if we were very fortunate, we had Schieberwurst. Translated means pushing sausage. A sliver of sausage like pepperoni size, about like the size of pepperoni, that we put on the edge of the bread, and as we took bites, we pushed the pepperoni down the length of the bread with our teeth until that last bite, which would then include the slice of sausage. We would also put lard on our bread, adding salt and onions if we had them. For muesli, we kids took bread and soaked it in milk and added sugar. For coffee, the adults drank muckefuck, a drink made from some roasted grain. Sometimes they added acorns, chestnuts, beech nuts, and the roots of the dandelion, which added a bit of kind of a chicory taste. It was sometimes called Ersatzkaffee, or replacement coffee. For lunch, Germans usually eat a large meal, the largest of the day, and for dinner or supper, we have Abendbrot, evening bread, consisting of bread and cold cuts and perhaps a soup.